It's The Pastor's Heart and Dominic Steele, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Today we're talking euthanasia and how to fight the issue, and also what to do, what are the consequences if euthanasia is eventually legalised. Legislation is about to come before the state parliament here in New South Wales that would allow euthanasia, and it's currently being debated by the parliament in Queensland. And given that laws permitting euthanasia have already been passed in Victoria, in Western Australia, in Tasmania and in New Zealand, there's a bit of a sense that even if the Conservatives succeed in holding out this time, at some stage it feels like it will happen. Patrick Parkinson said on this program last year that every culture war we've engaged in, we've eventually lost. In the UK, euthanasia is still illegal, but there's a debate on about that at the moment. In the United States, it's still illegal in most states, although significantly it is legal in the more progressive Washington, D.C. and in 7 states. Andrew Errington is Senior Minister of Newtown, Erskineville Anglican Church. Megan Best is a palliative care doctor and medical ethicist. She's an Associate Professor with the Institute of Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame. Megan, could we start with you and just what is going on in New South Wales and Queensland at the moment?
Well, as you said, Dominic, we've seen the dominoes fall around the country when it comes to the legalisation of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. In Queensland, there is a bill before Parliament which is expected to be debated in the next few weeks. There has been a draft bill released in New South Wales, but because of the COVID pandemic, we're not quite sure when that will be debated in New South Wales. I'd just like to say that Ireland has just rejected a euthanasia bill, so it's not inevitable in the short term.
Well, that's encouraging, yeah. Andrew, theologically, what's at stake?
I think there's a lot at stake, Dominic, but the big picture is, I think, whether we want to, as a society, maintain the core principle that there is no private right to kill one another. The Ten Commandments says, you shall not kill, and that doesn't... there are areas in which that doesn't apply, namely in the Old Testament, at least, in war, in judicial punishment. But within the Old Testament and within Christian ethics, a key principle has been that nobody has a private right to kill someone else. And the legalisation of euthanasia would, and is that. It's the legalisation of a situation. It's saying that there are certain situations in which we may now kill one another. And that's a Rubicon that I believe you should not cross. And that we're seeing pretty clearly, I think, that where it is crossed, it has significant consequences, not just for the practice of medicine and for the practice of end-of-life care, but for the whole culture of a society.
Now, I was intrigued that in Alex Greenwich's speech to the New South Wales Parliament, he called it voluntary assisted dying. Now, that's different to killing, but, or is it different? Megan, perhaps you could take us through the language that's used in these various pieces of legislation.
Well, voluntary assisted dying, I mean, it could mean lots of things, doesn't it? And that's probably why it's been chosen. But I think that it's quite clear that proponents of euthanasia have gone out of their way to confuse the language, which has allowed them to increase support for euthanasia by confusing it with other end-of-life practices that are legal and ethical. So a lot of palliative care staff would say that they're involved in voluntary assisted dying as well. But of course, what they do is quite different to what's proposed by Mr. Greenwich. So I think we need to be aware that if you look at the definition, as Andrew's just mentioned, we're looking about one person killing another. Either it's a doctor directly killing a patient, or a doctor providing medications for a patient to kill themselves. And the idea of voluntariness is inbuilt into the definition, of course it's going to be voluntary, because if you kill someone and they don't want you to, it's obviously murder. So the word voluntary doesn't need to be there because it's built into the definition, but it's added on because that makes it sound as if the risks of coercion are less. Euthanasia and suicide are felt to have negative connotations. We hear a lot in the media about the suicide problem and our need to try and reduce it. So people don't want to use the suicide word anymore. And euthanasia associates us with some of the misuses that are well known in countries like the Netherlands and Belgium. So we don't want to use that. So what are you left with? So we use voluntary assisted dying as a way of giving a false legitimacy to this killing by sort of inferring that it's a kind of a medical treatment, that it's something that the patient wants, that it's wrapped up with these ideas of compassion. So we get really a veil between us and what's really happening that makes it seem a lot more socially acceptable.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I agree with everything Megan said there. And just to add, I was quite deliberate in my use of language at the beginning. And that's because I think actually at the heart of all moral reasoning is the ability to name our actions rightly. Mm-hmm. And voluntary assisted dying, I think, is an attempt to avoid looking directly at what is actually going on. And that's not done. That's not done purely for kind of, it's done for some quite honest reasons sometimes, I think, which is that there's this sense that this kind of death is not quite right to call it killing or suicide. We ought to have a different name for it. But actually, I think that's inaccurate. When you look directly at it, the right names for it are either a form of killing or a form of killing oneself and suicide. It's a kind of hallmark of these debates, actually, a tendency to use language that obscures the matter. Mm. So a previous attempt to introduce legislation into the New South Wales Parliament used the language just throughout the bill of dying with dignity. And so die with dignity was used as a kind of stand-in to talk about what was going on. And I think when that happens, you've got a clue that something fishy is going on.
They're attempting to pull the wool over your eyes in some way.
Well, or I mean, that's the kind of suspicious version, and that might be right. But there is an honest version, which is that these matters are really difficult to think about and look at, and we're kind of trying to kid ourselves about them. Yeah.
Mm. You had a little nuance there between killing and voluntary suicide. Is there a distinction between those two?
Well, I'll say something Megan may want to add to it, but I think there is a distinction, because I think the involvement of, even though it's fine, the involvement of the doctor is importantly different if, on the one hand, the patient is not actively involved in the administration of lethal drugs, then I think morally speaking, they're being killed. Whereas if the patient is actively involved, then I think they are killing themselves, which is typically called a form of suicide. I don't want to overstate that distinction. I mean, in the biblical examples of things like those two kind of go together. You have examples of both mercy killings and of suicides. So I think there is a distinction, but I don't want to exaggerate its importance at this point.
Megan?
The more I think about it, the more I think it's about killing. You've got a person who does the killing, who provides the means for the killing. You have a person who wants to be killed, and we have a complicit society. These are the ingredients that you need for this process to happen. And I think that when we start looking at the suicide literature, I think that we unnecessarily complicate the issues. I think that just, if you look at the Ten Commandments, as Andrew said, that God is the one who has the prerogative of deciding when the end of life should come. We are not to take that on ourselves, whether it is to kill another person or to decide to kill oneself. So I think just in theological terms, it's much easier to think of it as killing.
My mother-in-law died 10 days ago.
I'm sorry to
of
hear.
old age. Yeah.
Yeah.
And last Thursday night, I was there with her. Last Friday night, I was there with her, with my wife on Thursday night. My wife was there all day Friday, and then she died Saturday morning. And I think dominant in my thoughts was, as she was so vulnerable and so dependent on really Kathy and her brother to make decisions for her good, we wanted to be making sure that we were making decisions genuinely for her good. And that was the kind of, if you like, the key moral matrix that we were thinking about. How do you advise people? Because you're there counselling people like us all the time, Megan.
Look, I think this is a very important aspect of the legislation that's often not discussed. Certainly, in my experience, people in palliative care are not going to stop caring for people, whatever decision they make for the end of life. So I think I'd just like to put that on the record. We're not saying we don't care about these people, we don't want to look after them. But in palliative care, we look after the family as well as the patient. We see the patient and the family as the unit of care. And it's obvious that the suffering at end of life is not experienced just by patients, but about the loved ones as well. And it can be a very difficult situation. And I think in that situation where you do have a substitute decision maker, it is very important to make sure that those people don't carry the guilt of decision making after the death, that in some way they precipitated the death by the decisions they made. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that if your motivation is certainly what that person would have wanted, I think that's the best way of making those decisions. That you are not there to make medical decisions. You are not usually family members don't have any medical expertise. They are there to be the voice of the patient. And if you think you're advising what the person would have said themselves if they were able to say it, I think you're doing the best possible job. But we know from government investigations that elder abuse is on the rise in our community. And the person who is most likely to abuse an elder is someone to whom they're related. It's more common in males than females. Males are more commonly the one to do the abuse. The women are the ones more likely to be abused. And financial abuse is the most common form of abuse at the end of life. I've certainly seen that in my own practice. And one of our concerns about this type of legislation is that people may have reasons for hastening death in an elderly person because of personal gains rather than the best interests of the patient. So that's certainly something. I mean, Christians know about human nature. I don't think we should be naive about these type of motivations. And it doesn't have to be something overt. I think that we know from the experience in all the jurisdictions where these kinds of things have been made legal, that the desire not to be a burden on your loved ones is one of the reasons people choose to have assisted suicide, euthanasia. And that can be something that you never say to your mother, but they just feel it because they see how your life is being impacted by your care for them. And I think it is unfair to make this option of legal euthanasia something that's available to elderly people. it's a threat that really shouldn't be in a sick room. I think it's something that vulnerable people at the end of life should be spared from.
Megan, can I just dig into for a moment, what does a request for euthanasia actually look like?
Thanks, Dominic. That's a great question, and it's one that's not often asked, but we have very clear research that shows that when someone raises the issue of euthanasia, it is not someone saying, I want you to kill me. It's a request for help. And the best response to someone raising the issue of euthanasia is to say, what's wrong and how can we help you? And I think that this is something that Christians can be very good at, is offering that hand of help to these very vulnerable people who are not coping with their situation. And that's why what I think a lot of these bills get wrong is saying, as soon as you ask for euthanasia, the doctor needs to make sure someone's on the euthanasia pathway. That is completely wrong. When someone first raises the issue of euthanasia, they need help. They need support. And that's what we need to provide, regardless of whether or not euthanasia laws get through.
I'm imagining you're saying that because it's not so much I'm in physical pain, but I'm in mental distress at the moment.
Absolutely. In the jurisdictions where euthanasia is legal, it's psychosocial problems that are most commonly the reason for somebody requesting euthanasia. Isolation, fear of becoming a burden, fear of becoming dependent on others, fear of things that may happen rather than things that are happening now. And physical pain is actually an uncommon reason why people would ask for euthanasia.
And just to add a footnote to that, actually the difficulties associated with depression are one of the major problems with actually safeguarding any legalised euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, because of course a wish to die is a classic diagnostic symptom of depression, but doctors are very bad at diagnosing depression. I don't want to be too, scathing about doctors, but the evidence is pretty well documented that actually doctors find it quite hard to get the diagnosis of depression right, and psychiatrists have consistently said that they would rather not be put on the line to, on the basis of a single consultation, determine if somebody's depressed. And yet you need such a screen if you're going to have, legal euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, because most people would agree that if in fact somebody's depressed, they ought to have a different course of treatment.
I think the reason for that is that the desire for hastened death is one of the symptoms of depression. So it's reasonable to screen people for depression if they say, I want someone to kill me. And one thing that's been quite notable in all the legislation for depression is even if you do diagnose depression, there's no requirement that someone gets treatment before they're killed. And if these laws were really about relieving suffering, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you say depressed people need treatment and then ask them again if they still want euthanasia?
I find it mind-boggling when that seems so clear to me that somebody wouldn't say, why are they actually, why are they going ahead? Why are they pushing ahead with this then?
But this is one of the examples of the kind of case in which, scholars of these laws observe quite consistently that laws always begin with what looks like a very sharply safeguarded, small kind of case that can access this service. But in every jurisdiction where euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are legal, you've seen a gradual weakening and an expanding of those safeguards. So to people who are, have psychiatric conditions or in some cases fit the category of being tired of life even, or people who are even physically disabled. And that's what I find most troubling here is you get this slide, at least in other places where this has been legal, you have seen, and people describe it as a textbook example of a slippery slope. You have seen a slide to make euthanasia available to a much wider range of conditions, including life experiences which, when the law was first introduced, everybody says we couldn't possibly allow it for those cases.
Talk to me about the complexities of if we do get this law passed, what are going to be the complexities for the Christian institutions? I'm thinking of the Anglicare aged care homes, the Uniting Church Wesley Mission aged care homes, those kind of places.
I might let Megan answer. She's way more qualified to answer that question.
I think we need to think of aged care homes and healthcare institutions as separate categories, because aged care in Australia is controlled at a Commonwealth level and hospitals at a state level. But I've been told by some senior administrators of these types of institutions saying that they would have to go out of business if they were forced to allow euthanasia on their premises. South Australia is the only state which has institutional conscientious objection allowed in the law itself. But in Victoria, what's happening is that after the implementation, there was a pathway where faith-based institutions were able to say there will be no euthanasia on our premises. If you want it, you'll need to be transferred to another institution because we are not going to be involved. And that while that has worked in many cases, when people decide they want euthanasia, at the very end, at the last minute, there have been some problems where they've been quite sick, and there has been pressure on those institutions to allow someone to die on their premises, even though there has been an agreement that it wasn't to be allowed, and there has been great moral distress on the part of the staff who think they are working in a place where it's not going to happen, having to observe it. There's also great moral distress from patients who thought they were somewhere where they were free from the risk of euthanasia, and suddenly, it's happening across the way. So I think that there's definitely problems in trying to work that out, and that it is much better for the institutions if it's written into the law rather than relying on the way that the law is interpreted afterwards. So we do need to protect organisations from that kind of thing. In Queensland, it's suggested that it's not going to be available, and that euthanasia advocates can actually go onto the ward in a faith-based institution without asking the administration, and that they would have access to patients there, which I think is just outrageous. And we wouldn't allow it for any other procedure, so why should we allow it for euthanasia? And I think that thought needs to be given to the fact that a lot of the safeguards that Andrew's mentioned, a lot of the rights of the staff and the institutions are being overrun because of this idea that euthanasia needs to be accessible anytime, anywhere to anyone. And I think it's quite problematic that we're asking doctors to squash their own personal convictions and be involved in this process when they don't want to. I just don't think it's good for the medical profession.
In the long run, I think, so we need to wait and see what happens with these laws and whether they pass and what they actually look like when they do. That will determine a lot, the kinds of possibilities we have. And like Megan's saying, some of those possibilities are quite troubling.
I mean, that's profoundly disturbing, what you've just described as currently on the books to be introduced in Queensland in a few weeks' time.
Yes, and I think that our governments aren't thinking about the people who don't want euthanasia. And there was a poll done in New Zealand, even though we're told 85% of people are in favour. I have a PhD student who did a study that showed that the wording of the question you ask can influence the responses by 20%. And in fact, The real support rate is around 65%, and that's what came up in the New Zealand referendum, 65% support. But in New Zealand, they then did a survey giving people more information, saying things like, would you still support euthanasia if you knew someone would get all the pain control they needed, regardless, of how much they needed? And people said, well, if I knew that, then no, I wouldn't support it. After they'd been given a lot more information about what's currently available and what euthanasia would involve, support ended up at 25% of the public. So I think our politicians need to think about people who want to know they are safe from the threat of euthanasia if they don't want it.
And so that's a good example of how I actually think, it is alarming, these possibilities before us, but I actually think the most important thing for us to do is to not be frightened, but to be clear about what we're going to do and what we think is right. You asked at the beginning about what's theologically at stake, and I think the other thing that I didn't mention is that what's at stake is what it means to honour your father and your mother. And we're in the midst of a debate about that. There are those who think what it means to honour your father and your mother is to give them autonomy. In the end, that's the only answer. Well, in the end, what will matter is that we're clear that we think, no, to honour our fathers and our mothers, we actually need to have a clear commitment to compassionate fellow suffering and palliative care. That's what we're going to stand for. We're going to be willing to suffer alongside the dying, and we're going to support and promote and do our best to seek the best palliative care we can. And if Christians can be people who are up for that, they can't be accused of lacking compassion, because we will be, God willing, deeply committed to action on the basis of the suffering we see. But that action will take the form of being with people in their dying and of doing what we can to ease their pain. And I think if we can be clear that that's what we're on about, we'll do all right.
And that's the true meaning of compassion, is to suffer with. And I always think of Job's comforters at the beginning of the book, where they see his distress from far off, and he's in so much agony, they just sit with him for 2 weeks and don't say anything. I know their reputation suffers after that, but I think that's the picture of compassionate care, where we stay with people. One of the greatest fears of people at the end of life is being left alone, and I think we can, if we make that promise that we won't leave people alone, no one gets left behind. We will walk alongside you, and we will not leave you. We're here for you. I think if we can give that message as Christian carers, I think that's the type of compassion that makes the big difference at the end of life.
My guests on the Pastor's Heart, Dr. Megan Best. She's a palliative care doctor and medical ethicist, associate professor with the Ethics and the Institute for Ethics and Society at Notre Dame University in Sydney. And Dr. Andrew Errington is senior minister of Newtown, Erskineville Anglican Church. You've been with us on the Pastor's Heart, and we will look forward to your company next Tuesday afternoon.